All right. Thank you for that wonderful lunch. That was delicious. All right, let me find my notes here. All right, this session is going to be about morality and the problem of evil. Fun stuff to talk about, right? All right, but it's important stuff to talk about. I actually do find it kind of fun to talk about because it's important for us to know how to respond to questions people have. And, you know, a big part of us studying apologetics, too, is not just learning how to answer other people's questions, but learning how to answer our own questions that we may have, and we never knew how to think about these things. So we're going to talk about this, and the next session will be about the historical reliability of the New Testament and the resurrection of Christ, and I think that we can cut that a little bit short, but still give you all of the main points. All right, so let's jump right into this because there's a lot to talk about, and we don't have a ton of time. This is the moral argument for the existence of God. Now, we've already talked about certain arguments for the existence of God. We've talked about the cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, the design argument, and now we're going to talk about the moral argument. And the moral argument is, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. Okay, we're going to jump into this and explain this and break it down. First of all, what are moral values and duties? Moral value refers to the worth of a person or action, whether it's good or bad, okay? So you all have moral value, or you're worth something. If somebody murders somebody, then they have done something immoral, right? Because that person had moral value. Now, moral duty refers to our obligation to act in a certain way, to not murder somebody, to not hurt somebody, to not harm someone else. That's a moral duty. So there's moral values and moral duties, okay? So the argument here is that moral values and duties are objectively true. What does that mean? This is the difference between objective truth and subjective truth. A subjective truth is made true by someone's opinion. An objective truth is true independent of human opinion. Here's an example of a subjective truth. This is me. I believe that chocolate is the best flavor of ice cream. You might disagree, and you probably do. You see, that's a subjective truth because it's rooted in the subject, which is me. It's made true by my opinion. It's not true for everybody, it's just true for me. But the truth is that I believe that chocolate ice cream is the best flavor of ice cream, a subjective truth. Here's an example of an objective truth. 2 + 2 = 4. Now, this is true despite your opinion. You can disagree with this. You can say, hey, you know what, I really think, and I believe this with everything in me, that 2 + 2 = 5. Well, you know, that's fine. You can think that, but it doesn't change the fact that 2 + 2 = 4. It's objectively true. It's a truth that is rooted in the object, not the subject that is stating this truth, okay? So I'm the subject, and I'm saying 2 + 2 = 4. That's not a subjective truth. It's not rooted in the subject. It's rooted in the object, the mathematical equation that we have here. 2 + 2 = 4. It's an objective truth. It is true for everybody at all times, and it does not matter what people's opinions are regarding this. It is objectively true. And our argument as Christians, as theists, is that moral values and duties are also objectively true. They are true despite your opinion. Somebody can disagree with your opinion, but they are still true because they are not made true by our opinion. They are made true because they are objectively true, and this is just the way that it is. All right. Let me just say that, I'll give you an example. Somebody might say to you, well, hey, you know what? Let me back up a little bit. Somebody might say, I think that it is morally acceptable to do drugs. And you could say, well, no, I disagree with that. Because you have moral worth. You have moral value. And you're hurting yourself when you do drugs. And therefore, it is an immoral thing to do. Now, it doesn't matter that their opinion, this is our argument as Christians. It doesn't matter that their opinion is different than ours because we believe that that moral value and moral duties are objectively true. They are true despite our opinions. And when I say that I believe it is immoral for somebody to do drugs because they're harming themselves, it doesn't become true because of my opinion. It simply is true, and I'm recognizing that truth. It's true objectively, okay? Just like 2 + 2 = 4. We did not invent this mathematical equation. We discovered it because God made it that way. It's objectively true, okay? So we're not saying here, and this is what people are going to commonly respond in this way, we're not saying that people can't be good without knowing God. Because people, what they're going to say to you is, well, you know, if you're telling me that moral values and duties are objectively true, an easier way to say this is that morality is objectively true. There are objective moral truths. If you're telling me that, then what you're saying is that people can't be good unless they know God, unless they have a relationship with God. And no, we're not saying that. We're not saying that people can't act in a moral way without having a relationship with God. We're saying that people can't be good if there is no God. Because God is the source of moral truth. And we're going to talk about this. So we're not saying to people, hey, you know what? Atheists can't be good people. No, atheists can be very moral people. They can act in a moral way. They can be good without knowing God, but they couldn't be good if God didn't exist, because if God didn't exist, there would be no such thing as moral truth. And we're going to get into this and explain why. But I want to share this quote with you. This is from C.S. Lewis, who was a Christian apologist, but before he was a Christian, he was an atheist. And he said, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust, but how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. This is why I love C.S. Lewis, because he just knows how to say it. What a great way to say it. You know, if you don't know what a crooked line is, how can you know what a straight line is? If you don't know what is morally right, then you have to have some sense of moral values. It has to be in you. And it's not based upon your opinion. It's just objectively true that there are objective moral truths. Now, we're going to go through this kind of quickly for the sake of time, and I apologize for that, but I'm hoping that everybody can grasp what we're talking about here. And we're going to dig into this a little bit deeper in a minute. This is something that people will often say to you if you tell them that there are objective moral truths and that people can't just make up their own ideas about morality, that there is a transcendent standard that exists. And that's really what C.S. Lewis was getting at. So the idea of there being objective moral truths is that there is this transcendent moral law. Transcendent mean that it is outside of human beings, okay? We didn't create it. It simply exists, and we recognize it. We recognize that it exists. Just like the laws of logic and the laws of mathematics, we didn't invent those. We discovered them. We recognize that they exist. They are transcendent. And the argument that we make as Christians is that morality is objectively true in the sense that there is a transcendent moral law that exists that everybody understands. They don't necessarily live by it. They don't necessarily agree with it. I mean, none of us live by it perfectly, right? We're all sinners saved by the grace of God. None of us are perfect. But we recognize that there is this transcendent moral law that exists, something that is beyond us. We didn't invent it. We just recognize it. And people will often respond in this way. And this sounds like a very sophisticated argument, but I'm going to show you why it's not. This is called the Euthyphro dilemma. That's a weird name, right? Euthyphro dilemma. It comes from the writings of Plato. there was this dialogue that Socrates was having with this guy named Euthyphro. And this was part of their conversation. They were talking about God and morality. Now, the Euthyphro dilemma is this. Is something good because God wills it to be good, or does God will something because it is good? If you say that something is good because God wills it to be so, then what is good becomes arbitrary. God could have willed that torture be good. So this is what an atheist might say in response when you tell them that there are objective moral truths that come from God. He might say, hey, you know what? Think about this. If you're telling me that something is morally good just because God wills it to be so, then that's completely arbitrary, because he could will anything to be good. He could will torture to be good, and then that would have to be good. But if you say that God wills something because it is good, then what is good or bad is independent of God. God's simply recognizing it and saying that's good. So then it's not dependent upon God. So then they might say, what need is there for God as the basis of morality? I know this is a kind of a complicated argument, and I understand we're going through this quickly, but I just want you to be exposed to this here before you're exposed to it out in the world, so you know how to answer it. Or you at least understand that there is a logical response to this, okay? So the question is, well, let's keep going. We'll get to it. This is what we call a false dilemma. Why is it a false dilemma? A false dilemma is because there's a third alternative. All they're doing is giving us two alternatives. And they're saying, well, if God wills it to be good just because, well, then he could will anything to be good. But if he's recognizing it's good and telling us it's good, then it's good independent of him. Either way, God's not necessary for something to be morally good. So they're presenting only two possibilities. This is why we call it a false dilemma. There's a third alternative, that God wills something because he is good. God's own nature is the standard of goodness, and his commands are the expression of his nature. And it would be contrary to God's nature to make commands that would harm the creation that he loves. So he doesn't recognize something as good and say, oh, that's good, you need to do that. And he doesn't just say, this is good because I say so. Instead, God's nature is the very standard of goodness, and his commands are the expression of his nature. All right. I know we're going quick, but I don't want to keep you guys here until 8 o'clock tonight. So, again, all these slides are going to be up online. You can go back and review all of this, okay? Now we're going to maybe slow down a little bit, and this might be a little bit easier to digest. We're going to talk about moral relativism, okay? The belief that moral truths are subjective, that your opinion makes something true. Like my favorite flavor of ice cream. Like I think that chocolate ice cream is the best flavor of ice cream. Well, that's subjectively true. That truth is rooted in the subject, in me. It's not objectively true for everybody, because the truth isn't rooted in the object, the ice cream. It's just my personal opinion. And a subjective truth is made true because of someone's opinion. An objective truth is true despite someone's opinion. Even, if we look at the example of Nazi Germany, if the Nazis had succeeded and either exterminated or brainwashed everybody on the planet to believe that killing Jews was good, it still would be wrong. It doesn't matter that that's their opinion or the opinion of every person on the planet. It is still wrong, because it's objectively true that murdering Jews is wrong, okay? It doesn't matter if everybody's opinion is different. Objective truths are true independent of people's opinions. But now we're talking about the opposite. We're talking about moral relativism, which is the belief that moral truths are subjective and that your opinion makes it true. And if you start looking around, you'll see very quickly that this is a very popular way of thinking. in our culture. So this is what to ask someone who claims to believe in moral relativism. Because, you know, people, and look, we're all guilty of this. When I was young, I remember telling my parents, you know, this is what I think, and I think this is okay for this reason. And I was thinking that my opinions made it true. But my opinions don't make it true. What makes it true is God has willed something out of his own nature, and that is the standard of morality that we all know. Okay, so, you know, we're all guilty of doing this in some way at some point in our lives, but we have to think about this, about how to respond to this, what to ask someone who claims to believe in moral relativism. Now, ask them, if somebody stole from you or slandered you, what would your reaction be? Okay? If someone says, I have my standard of morality and you have yours, then you can ask them, okay, you believe that your opinions make something morally true. So if somebody stole from you or slandered you or walked up behind you when you were walking down the street and hit you over the head and stole your wallet, when you came to, what would your response be? Would you be thinking to yourself, oh, well, that's just that guy's view of morality? No big deal. I have a different view of morality than he does. I think it's wrong to do that, but he obviously thinks it's okay, and that's fine with me because every moral opinion is of equal value, right? So it's okay that this guy decided that it's all right to hit me over the head and steal my wallet. Of course you wouldn't respond that way. You know, you wouldn't just dismiss it and say that that's just his view of moral moral values. You would say, I've been wronged. Somebody wronged me. Somebody hit me over the head, knocked me out, and stole my wallet. I'm mad. I want to find this guy, and I want to, you know, I want to put him in jail. I want to find out who he is. And if you have ever in your life felt wronged, then that is an indicator that moral values are not made true by your own opinion, but there is a transcendent standard that exists. Because if somebody has wronged you, then what you're doing is you're saying, hey, wait a minute, that guy hasn't lived up to the moral standard that exists, that he should have recognized. He should have known it was wrong to do that. That guy should have known not to cut me off in traffic, right? I mean, we hold other people to that transcendent moral standard, but we so easily allow ourselves to ignore it. But the reason that we feel wronged sometimes is because we all know that there is a transcendent moral standard that exists, and we expect everybody else to abide by it because we know that it's true, that there is a transcendent moral standard. So anyone who says that they think that moral truths are just completely relative, they can't live that way. You can't live that way because as soon as somebody violates that transcendent moral standard by hurting you, then you immediately are no longer a moral relativist. Because if you were, you would just say, hey, you know, that's his view of morality. I'm not angry. But of course we don't respond that way. It's just not possible for moral truths to be subjective. And here's why. Because when we talk about moral relativism, we're talking about this idea that moral truths are subjective. Subjective morality, the idea that something is morally true because of our opinion, requires a person to measure the moral value of something. Think about that. Subjective morality requires a person to measure the moral value of something. If somebody says to you, I think that it is perfectly okay to, I don't know, have premarital sex, they have weighed the options, they have looked at whether or not it is morally okay, and they have made a decision. They have measured that act against something. And what they have measured it against is that transcendent standard of morality, and they've decided that that's okay. So it's, again, subjective morality requires a person to measure the moral value of something. If a transcendent moral standard did not exist, the concept of moral value could not exist. Do you understand that? That if there was not a transcendent standard of morality, none of us would have any idea what morality even is. So if you're saying, hey, morality is relative, and I'm just making up, this is my view of morality, well, what you're doing is you're recognizing there's a moral standard, and you're weighing it in your mind. Is it moral or is it immoral? And you're saying, hey, this is moral. So what you're disagreeing with somebody about is the conclusion that they've come to. You know, this is what I believe and that's what you believe, but ultimately, you have to, in order to form opinion of morality, you have to understand that there's a moral standard that you're measuring these things against. So you have to recognize that truth. So again, subjective morality requires a person to measure the moral value of something. If a transcendent moral standard didn't exist, the concept of moral value could not exist. This means that either objective morality exists or no morality exists. The conclusion here is that morality exists, therefore objective morality exists. These slides are going to be online. Don't worry. But I want you to be exposed to this because I want you to understand that this idea of moral relativism doesn't make sense, because if somebody is forming an opinion about morality, they are recognizing the fact that morality exists. How do they know that? They know that because there's a transcendent standard of morality that they are weighing things against. They're measuring things against it and deciding what they believe is moral. All right. This is a typical accusation from somebody who's a moral relativist. They'll say to you in a conversation, you're telling them that they think you think that something they're doing is immoral, and they say, you have no right to impose your morals on me. Anyone ever tell you that? You have no right to impose your morals on me. You Christians are always doing that. Don't you understand that we all have our own view of morality? You have absolutely no right to impose your morals on me. Here's the response. Then why are you imposing your morals on me? Because that's exactly what they're doing. If they're saying to you, you have no right to impose your morals on me, what they're actually saying is, it's immoral for you to do that. So they're recognizing the fact that this transcendent standard of morality exists. And again, their claim here is self-defeating. If they say, you have no right to impose your morals on me, well, that's exactly what they're doing to you. They're telling you, you have no right to do that. Well, what does that mean? If there's no standard of morality, what does that mean? How can I have no right to do that? They're recognizing the fact that that transcendent standard exists when they make that claim. All right. This is the humanist view of morality. The humanist view of morality is the belief that moral duties are determined by what promotes human flourishing. Now, a lot of people out there will say, okay, I agree with you. You know, morality exists. We know that morality exists, but I don't believe it came from God. I think that it came this way. I believe that moral duties, that is, our actions towards one another, are determined by what promotes the most human flourishing, what's best for society. That's how we get our morals. It's from society, right? Society tells us what's okay and what's not okay. Here's the problem. If morality is grounded in cultural consensus, then moral reform is not possible. For example, during the civil rights movement here in this country, those who were working within the civil rights movement and trying to end segregation, according to this belief, would be immoral because they were working against the common consensus in those states. So if morality is grounded in cultural consensus, if the majority decides that this is moral and this is best for human flourishing, then anyone who goes against that is immoral, and moral reform isn't possible. So obviously this idea doesn't make sense. Now here's the second problem. If moral truths come from the majority consensus, then people who hold a minority position are by definition immoral, meaning that I gave the example here of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a Christian pastor in Nazi Germany who opposed the Nazis, and he was arrested and executed. So if this is true, then Dietrich Bonhoeffer was immoral. If morality comes from society and everything that is morally true is true because the majority decides it's true, and they decide it's best for human flourishing, like the Nazis decided it was best for human flourishing if they eliminated the Jews, if that's true, then people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer are immoral, and so are we as Christians in this country, because there are a lot of things that are legal in this country that we as Christians know are immoral. And if we oppose that, even if our government says, no, this is moral, then we become immoral simply by going against what has been accepted in our society. So morals do not come from society, okay? It's just the humanist view of morality. All right, here's a common accusation made against Christians. You only hold a certain view on morality because that's what you were taught. You're only telling me that because that's what your pastor tells you, you know? Or you only think that because you're a Christian. Or you only even, you're only a Christian because you grew up in the United States. You know, if you grew up in another country, then you'd have a different religion. Well, what do you say to that? This is a common accusation made against Christians. You only hold that view because that's what you were taught. This is an example of something in logic that is called the genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy, it's fallacious reasoning. When someone judges a claim based solely on its origin rather than the actual merits of the claim. So when somebody says something like that to you and they say, you know, you only hold a certain view of morality because that's what you were taught, what they are doing is they are committing the genetic fallacy. It's faulty reasoning. And they are judging your claim based solely on how you came to know it rather than on the actual merits of your claim. Now, we know that it's objectively true that 2 + 2 = 4, right? Maybe you were taught that in school, maybe you were taught by your parents, maybe you heard it in a song on the radio, or maybe you read it in a fortune cookie. It makes no difference how you came to know it. It's true. How you came to know it has no bearing whatsoever on whether or not it's true. It is objectively true. And so when somebody says to you, well, you only have that view of morality because you're a Christian, or because that's what you were taught by your parents, or whatever it is, they're committing the genetic fallacy. They're judging your argument based solely on the origin of the claim rather than on the actual merits of the claim. They're ignoring the truth of what you're saying and attacking you, saying you only believe that because that's how you were taught. But, you know, it doesn't matter how I learned 2 + 2 = 4. It's true no matter what. It's true independent of my opinion. All right. Now, I want to look at the problem of evil. Why do we call it a problem? This is a common atheist claim. If an all-powerful, all-loving God existed, evil would not exist. Evil does exist, therefore, they claim, God does not exist. All right, so this argument attempts to prove that it is not logically possible for God to exist. When we talk about the problem of evil, we have to understand that this is something that we have to be very, very sensitive towards. Because I think that what you'll find with a lot of people who are atheists is that they are atheists because they've experienced trauma, they've experienced difficulty in life, they feel like God was not there for them, they feel like life is so difficult that God could not possibly exist, and we have to be sensitive to that. Okay, so again, I'm giving you these arguments so that you can understand where they're coming from and understand how to minister to them, right? Because we're all ministers, right? You don't have to be a pastor to minister to somebody. If you're a Christian, that's our job, right? And so we have to be very sensitive towards this idea of evil, the existence of evil in the world. But this is the argument. If an all-powerful, all-loving God existed, evil would not exist, because if God is all-powerful and he's all-loving, he wouldn't want evil to exist, right? But it does. It exists. Therefore, they claim God does not exist. Okay, I want to show you how we can respond to this. This is the solution. If an all-powerful, all-loving God existed, they say, evil would not exist. And our response is, evil does exist, and God has a good reason for allowing it to exist. Therefore, the existence of evil does not disprove God's existence. Again, we have to be very sensitive when we're dealing with issues like this. And I think that, as a pastor, what I've seen over the years is that oftentimes when people are walking away from God, it's because of some trauma they've experienced, and they feel like God wasn't there for them. And, I think that many of us in our lives, if you've been walking with God for a long time, there are times in your life where it's really difficult to understand how God could let certain things happen. And so we need to be sensitive. But there's a problem with their logic. They're presuming that God would not have any reason for evil to exist. And so this is the Christian response. This is how we need to look at it. And I'm not suggesting that you just make this argument towards somebody who's hurting. What I'm saying is you need to understand as a Christian that there is a response, and that's what it is. Now, why would somebody who's an atheist think that? That if God existed, then there wouldn't be evil. But evil exists, therefore God must not exist. Well, you have to understand the perspective of an atheist. Their perspective is that this life is the only life. And so, as an atheist, you can get tunnel vision and think that, okay, this life is the only life there is, so if there was a God, it would just make sense that all this evil in the world wouldn't be here. This evil wouldn't exist if God really existed. But you see, Christians have a very different perspective about life. And our perspective is that this life is just a small fraction of time relative to eternity, okay? And if we had if I was to draw a line across that wall representing eternity, and I just put a little pencil mark on one point on the line, that would be like representing our life, this life that we're living, and then that line would go on forever. That's eternity, okay? And so this is the Christian perspective, that this life is not all there is, okay? This life is a small fraction of time relative to eternity. So we have this eternal perspective. And we also understand that God's purpose for our lives is not to keep us from pain. Now, oftentimes God will do that, and it's okay to pray to the Lord and ask for that. But that's not God's purpose for our lives. His purpose for our lives is that we live in relationship with Him so that He can be glorified through our lives. Okay? So we need to understand that sometimes when we experience pain or we experience suffering, God is going to bring glory from it. And God is going to work all things together for good for those who are called according to His purpose. And so we need to have that perspective. And an atheist does not understand that. And so that's where they're coming from. They're thinking, hey, this life is all there is, and this life is full of misery and sorrow and evil. How could God exist? Well, it's because they have spiritual blinders on. And don't forget that, right? They have spiritual blinders. If those spiritual blinders were lifted, they would be able to see what we see, that this life is not all there is, and God's purpose for our life is that we live in relationship with Him so that He can be glorified through our lives. Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, "Therefore, we do not lose heart, but though our outer man is decaying, yet our inner man is being renewed day by day. For momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison, while we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal." And this is the perspective that we need to have as Christians, that this life is not all there is. And when we do go through suffering in this life, the Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. You see, for an atheist, they don't have a relationship with God, but we do. And so we look at pain and suffering and evil in a much different way than they look at it. Now the question has to be asked, why would an all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful God allow evil? I mean, we need to be able to answer that question as Christians. We need to be able to answer it at least for ourselves, if not for others. So why would God allow evil? In order to love God, we must possess the freedom to give that love. Think about somebody in your life who you love. It might be your wife or your husband or your mother, your father or your children or a friend, whoever it might be. If you weren't free to give that love, would it truly be love? You see, without free will, we would be like pre-programmed robots. We wouldn't really be able to love anybody. We would just be going through the motions. It would be like creating a robot and programming it to act like it loves you. But would that robot really love you? No. To really give love, we have to be free to give that love. And free will requires the ability to choose between an act of good, loving God, and an act of evil, rebelling against God. And that's very important. We need to understand that. Because if we didn't have free will, then we couldn't really love God and we couldn't really love anybody else. We have to be free to give that love. And freedom requires us to be able to choose between good and evil, between loving God and rebelling against God. And the other thing that we know as Christians that atheists don't understand, and they can't understand, is that God is going to deal with evil. Okay? Sometimes it seems like there's so much suffering and so much torment in this life that we just can't make sense of it, but we have to remember in those moments that God is eventually going to deal with evil. This is Revelation 20:10. And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone where the beast and the false prophet are also, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. God is going to deal with our enemy, the devil. He's going to deal with him. We can't forget that. This is Revelation chapter 21. This is what we have to look forward to as Christians, and we know that this is true. Then I saw a new heaven. This is John writing this. I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and there is no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he will dwell among them, and they shall be his people. And God himself will be among them. And he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And there will no longer be any death. There will no longer be any mourning or crying or pain. The first things have passed away." The first things, what we're experiencing now in this life, are going to pass away. God wins. Praise the Lord. And we have eternity with him. And this is the Christian perspective. Evil is a very difficult thing for us to deal with because it creates sorrow and it creates suffering. And many times Christians find themselves at points in their lives where they just are overwhelmed by such things. But in those moments, we have to cling to God and to his word and remember that this life is not all there is. There is eternity with our Savior. Praise the Lord. It's the end of that session. Don, would you like to say anything? A little break or?
Yeah, let's take 5 minutes.
Okay, well. All right, so we'll take a 5-minute break.